So, for my final project, I wanted to highlight one of my favorite topics that we studied this semester, and that is sexism versus misogyny. In Kate Mann's Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, she defines each term and then articulates the differences between them and why that differentiation matters. I found it incredibly interesting since these two terms are often conflated, and so I know this is something I wanted to explore more in my final project. I have recently become a little bit obsessed with Princess Diana and her short life with the royal family. She's definitely had a resurgence in popularity. There's the Netflix show The Crown, the movie that just came out, Spencer, and there's even a musical about her running on Broadway right now. I think it's really interesting how many people are captivated by her life and how many women connect with her story and relate to that feeling of being unheard. The more I learn about her, the more reason I find to sympathize with her, and also there's this sort of anger I feel for how unjustly she was treated by both the public and her family. So I thought I would combine my interests and diagnose the misogyny and the sexism in her story. With the Meghan and Harry Oprah interview that happened earlier this year, I thought I would talk about how women, in the public eye especially, are mistreated and ignored for the sake of basically just aesthetics, and how that pattern is still perpetuated. So now that you kind of understand my line of thinking, let's go ahead and get into talking about Diana. So I'm going to start by giving some quick background information on the very early days of her being introduced into the royal family. Diana Spencer was very young when she first met the royal family, since she lived next door to Sandringham, their vacation home. Charles, who we know she eventually marries, began dating her older sister Sarah when Diana was still a teenager. This was because Charles's longtime love interest, Camilla Shand, had married Andrew Parker Bowles, but we'll actually talk about her more later. Eventually, Sarah and Charles split after a short fling, but through her, Charles had met Diana when she was around 16 and he was 29. This age gap is pretty startling, especially since they were married only 3 years later, but I think it's important to highlight it because it only adds to the imbalance of power between Diana and Charles that stem not just from his title, but also the way gender works in our society. So before we dive any deeper, let's touch briefly back on Camilla. It's widely known that the royal family frowned on Camilla and Charles's relationship because she was deemed unsuitable. According to Princess Mountbatten, they were ideally suited, we know that now, but it wasn't possible. This only worsened once Camilla married Andrew, as divorce was considered taboo amongst the royal family, and so began the quest to find Charles an intact wife. Being only 19 at the time of their marriage, Diana perfectly suited this idea of the chaste and untouched princess. However, it is essential to note that this line of thinking backfired horrendously, as Charles never stopped seeing Camilla, who he of course eventually married after Diana's untimely death. Speaking of, let's talk about affairs and double standards. So Charles notoriously cheated on Diana with Camilla and was very open about it. He was even seen wearing cufflinks with Camilla's initials on them, as pictured here. Eventually, after years of tolerating a shattered and emotionally abusive marriage, Diana began her own series of extramarital affairs. However, how her affairs were received was very different, as Diana was expected to remain faithful as both a wife and mother. Now that we have some background information established, I want to discuss the traumatic side of her relationship with Charles. Diana was known to have struggled with mental illness and a variety of associated issues, including eating disorders, self-harm, depression, and even suicide attempts that spiraled during her marriage with Charles. Diana is attributed with saying, "My husband put his hand on my waistline and said, 'Oh, a bit chubby here, aren't we?' And that triggered off something in me." This comment reminded me of something we learned about in class regarding body image in society, including fat phobia. It's something Samantha Irby discussed in We Are Never Meeting in Real Life, saying, "Fat babies are adorable, while fat children are a little less so. Fat teenagers are chided into either end of the eating disorder spectrum, and fat adults are either admonished for not figuring out how to get new bodies during adolescence, or straight up dismissed altogether." Diana also struggled with depression that resulted in a number of harmful behaviors, all of which stemmed from her unhappiness in her marriage, pressure from the public, lack of autonomy, or lack of a voice in general. Diana allegedly spoke of her struggles with self-harm, saying, "I picked up Charles's penknife off his dressing table and scratched myself heavily down my chest and both thighs. There was a lot of blood, and he hadn't made any reaction whatsoever." Similarly, she said, "We stayed up there at Balmoral from August to October. I got terribly, terribly thin. People started commenting, 'Your bones are showing.' By October, I was in a very bad way. I was so depressed, and I was trying to cut my wrist with razor blades. It rained and rained and rained. I came down early to London to seek treatment, not because I hated Balmoral, but because I was in such a bad way." Each of these comments speak to Diana's plea for help, feeling helpless under a system that was suppressing her voice. Eventually, this culminated in numerous suicide attempts, including once when she was pregnant with her second son, Harry. She said, "I had told Charles I felt desperate. I was crying my eyes out. He said I was crying wolf. 'I'm not going to listen,' he said. 'You're always doing this to me. I'm going riding now.' So I threw myself down the stairs." This very brief and tragic summary of Diana's life leads me to an important question. Where is the misogyny and where is the sexism? There are a couple of key moments that point to both. Kate Manne defines misogyny as the system that polices and enforces the patriarchal social orders governing norms and expectations. Charles's comments on her body, for starters, come from his expectations of women to be thin and beautiful. Even the non-response from the royal family in regards to her struggle goes back into the idea that women's problems don't matter, and are, rather, best kept silent. Also, the fact that Diana was expected to remain faithful to Charles despite his infidelity is the policing of her behavior. I think when you line it all up, it seems impossible that this was allowed to go on. But that free pass to ruin this person's life ultimately ties back to sexism, which Manne defines as the patriarchal ideology that justifies and rationalizes a patriarchal order. This encompasses all the double standards in her story. Despite all of Charles's dalliances prior to marriage, the reasoning behind Camilla's unsuitability to marry into the family was that she wasn't a virgin and Diana was. Both judgments feed into the archaic virginity and purity culture surrounding women. Also, we know the royals policed Diana's affairs and not Charles's, but even this speaks to the standard that women should be pure and nurturing only. Lastly, the entire obsession with Diana's appearance boils back to women being valued for their beauty and appearances, which can lead to a whole variety of problems, as Diana's case shows. I could really go on and on about all the injustices in her short and tragic life, but I want to conclude with my lasting impression. All of the quotes I have read from Diana come from the infamous tell-all titled Diana, Her True Story, written by Andrew Morton in 1992 in collaboration with the princess. It truly blows my mind that she so vehemently vocalized her struggles both publicly and privately, yet she was still ignored, mistreated, and, ultimately, abandoned. I think it's interesting to look back at her life in 2021, especially after hearing Meghan Markle's eerily similar accounts of her own experiences with royal life. I think being able to apply these critical terms that I've learned to her story only makes it that much sadder, because it points at both the systemic and personal oppressions that she fell victim to. However, I think being able to have a vocabulary to talk about her story gives me a clearer perspective of the situation as a whole. Sure, part of it has to do with the preservation of public image from a governing structure that is as old as the monarchy, but I think it more so has to do with the overall mistreatment of women, especially those that are put in the public eye, and ultimately, I think that just makes it all the more important to have the toolkit to articulate how the systems of power interact with gender.